Hey, welcome back everybody. It's time for part 2 on the Predicta Princess that I'm working on for a client. Last time we looked at it, I had the main deflection board rebuilt. We tested that out, saw we got a raster, but it was a bit small. Didn't fill the whole picture. Brightness control, not a lot to work with. And of course, without the high voltage cage on, we were getting some interference from the flyback with the audio circuits and some other things. So since then, I have put the can back on. I've actually added some rubber grommets to the horizontal drive tube there and for the high tension lead, or the anode lead there. More importantly though, I have replaced all the electrolytics. So the power supply work is all done, and I want to verify that I didn't screw anything up. To give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, there are three electrolytic cans in this guy. There's a 4-section that lives over here, single section that bolted onto the side of the high voltage cage, and then a 3-section that lived over here just behind the power transformer. For the most part, I was able to put the capacitors exactly where their respective cans lived. Not always. Earlier I moved the one that was clamped here to this post. That was an easy way to do it. Ground was available and it connected right up. The 4-section, I was able to get all 4 sections moved here. However, it did require a little bit of rewiring. And I can actually get you a little bit closer here. So since most of the wiring is coming in from here, it was kind of short. It was pulled around this transformer, pulled fairly taut, not a lot of slack. So as I moved the capacitors further this way, I realized I was going to have to do wire extensions or just outright wire replacement. Ultimately, wire replacement wound up being easier. At least one of these, capacitors, like this guy here, was actually a wire going up to the board for the 140-volt bus, all sharing a common negative. That was easy to tie in, but I did have to replace the wiring for a few of these. That's the yellow and the blue coming back to this terminal strip here. Blue ties onto one end of this cement resistor, and then the yellow one ties in just over here. But overall, very easy to route everything. In order to mount them, though, more importantly, I was trying to figure out how to get a terminal strip in there that would be long enough to handle everything. The problem is, when I took the capacitor out, I realized that the space underneath it was not perfectly flat. There are holes in there because when they stamped the chassis, the mount for this electrolytic is actually stamped out and then bent up, creating a hole right there. So there's no way for me to properly mount this length of terminal strip with the two mounting ears. However, I realized I could very easily flip it and then put 2 holes in the side of the chassis here and mount it like this. So I drilled for 2 number 6 screws, and I use these wonderful nuts that have built-in outside toothed washers on them, so you don't have to use a separate lock washer, and it's not a juggling act to get the hardware in there and tightened. So that worked out great. Separate ground connections for everything, all tied back to a main ground that goes back into the chassis. There is, however, a 5th capacitor here, this little guy off. This is actually part of the audio B+, which is over here at the top left of the board. Well, from the front of the TV anyway. That is actually from the electrolytic that lives over here. So the 3-section can that used to live right there has a 10 microfarad at 450 volts, a 20 microfarad at 350, and a 100 microfarad at 50 volts. This one over here, this guy over here is the 10 at 450. I just moved it over that way for convenience sake because I wanted to put a terminal strip over here and running out of space to put them. And I only have 3 luggers. That's the only one that would actually fit in there reasonably. So I drilled another hole for that, mounted it, and I simply moved that capacitor over and then ran the wire over to it and shortened it a little bit. That was easy. The remaining 2, the wiring for them was long enough to reach this, including the ground connections, so I just reused the existing wiring, and that about did it. All in all, pretty clean. I'm very happy with how it turned out. But now we need to see if my work is actually worth the darn. So I am going to get this popped back in the chassis, and I will meet you at fire up. Alright, that's maximum brightness right there, so that's about as good as it's going to get. Turn the volume down. I might have put the shield back on the high voltage cage, but I have also taken the shield off the IF strip, so that ain't helping. And that's probably gonna wash out the video just a little bit there. Turn that back off. Yeah, it's rolling a little bit there. I want to see. Yeah, 215 volts. We're almost completely filling the screen, which is nice. You adjust the vertical lock. Alright, that's about where it's happy. Yeah, I really need to buy a better pattern generator. This is a good novelty, but it's not as good as it could be. Those fancy digital ones would be real nice. Anyway, set still works. On to the IF strip it is. Alright, I have extracted the IF board, and I've also gone in here and cleaned up the area. There's quite a bit of dust underneath it. Tried to get that pretty decent before it eventually goes back in. Unlike the main board, a few of the connections on here, and there are very few. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 connections. At least... yeah, 2 of them, this the video out connection and this guy right here, these 2 were actually soldered to their posts. Everything else was just wrapped. So it was pretty easy to get out. I also removed most, if not all, of the excess solder out of these forks because putting them back in place, the solder tends to pool at the bottom and it hangs up on everything and you can't get the board back in. I just like to clean that. I'll need to clean the pins that slot into those as well, since there's a lot of it on that. But we can take a quick look here. Now that this is out, this should be pretty straightforward to deal with. Board's in good shape. But unlike the rest of it, you can see we have one piece, probably Amphenol brand sockets. Maybe? Can't quite tell. But yeah, we're going to have to leave those alone. Nothing wrong with them. This disc right here should be, I believe Sam's refers to it as K1. It's a 2-pin couplet that apparently just has an RC network inside of it. Just 2 components. I have a replacement for that. And then, of course, all of the resistors will be carefully replaced. And I've already started scrubbing the gunk off the board here. Not that it really matters, it's going to get a cover put over it, but I just like having things clean when they go back together. Alright, I'll see you in a bit after I get this repopulated. Okay, I'm almost done with the IF board here. I've got everything on it replaced except for this one resistor at the back. This is a 120 ohm. As it turns out, I have absolutely no 120 ohm resistors. Well, I've got some 1/8 watts, but that's not going to cut it. So I need to snag one of those online, put in another order. But in the meantime, since I've taken care of pretty much everything else here and also replaced the singular couplet that goes right there, the original is actually marked on the outside with the resistance value, 68 ohms, which must be in parallel with the capacitor because I do register about 68 ohms on that and the new one. But I'm going to set this assembly aside for a moment because I want to hop into the tuner while I have the opportunity. This is pretty easy to remove. There are simply 3 sheet metal screws that hold it on, one here at the back, and these 2 accessible from the bottom. The main thing on the tuner here is this one paper cap. It's got a 0.22 microfarad at 100 volts on the top there. There are resistors inside this assembly, and I do want to take a look and see if, because I believe there's at least one high wattage resistor that's in here that is part of the plate circuit, I think, and I want to make sure that one is still in tolerance. This is an area where I probably won't mess too much with things, assuming I can figure out how this comes apart. Oh, gotta do a little bit of prying here. This sort of snaps into place. Try and be gentle about it. Have these little dimples in the sheet metal that these click into. You have to get it up and off of every one. Now, let's see. Back's not really being held on by anything other than these. And I should be able to just... Oh, I'm snagging on something. Trying to be as gentle as I can. Oh, the bracket here is blocking it. I gotta remove this. Okay, there we go. Ah, yes, there are, looks like 3 decently sized. I'm sorry, the lighting is not good right here. This resistor here, that one there, and that one there. That one is very clearly at least a 1-watt resistor. These 2 guys, the bodies appear to be molded plastic. I need to double check. Those may actually be axial lead capacitors in the picofarad range. Yeah. And beyond that, there is no way in hell I'm going to be able to access some of the smaller ones. Like there's a resistor tucked in here, the resistor back in here on the tube socket. I definitely want to check the high wattage ones and verify what these are. It looks like wax on, yeah, it's just wax. But that's really all I need to mess with or want to. There are some resistors in here. I'm just going to check the values and make sure everything's okay. There's 1, 2 on the band switches there. A friend of mine warned me about replacing anything in the tuner section because of the frequencies involved. Carbon composition resistors are just purely resistive elements. Modern carbon film and metal film resistors are laser etched onto a cylinder, and because you basically scribe it along the outside surface of that material in order to make it to change the resistance, you've also made it an inductor. It's basically a coil of conductive material. So apparently metal films are worse for it. They're more inductive than carbon films. Both carbon and metal films still have a little bit of inductance to them. And if you use them in tuner circuits, you can throw things off if you're not careful. I have never messed with tuners. I've never messed with aligning them. So I'm hesitant to change anything in here. And the nice thing is, because the tuner is a separate plug-in piece, unlike the PCBs, the IF strip and everything, if I need to service this again, this can come out very easily. Like, it's off by itself. In fact, I don't think you even need to remove the rest of the chassis, because this is all the way off to the left, and as soon as the back is off, you should be able to just extract this straight out. So, I'm going to do a little bit of checking in here, replace that one cap, make sure everything is up to snuff, and then if it is, I'm just going to leave well enough alone. Although, since we're in here, I'll probably take some Q-tips and try to... Oh yeah, that's very sticky. There's a lot of crap in here, so I'm going to try and clean up all of the wafer switches as best I can. And we'll pull the tubes and see how those are doing. Okay, the tuner was pretty straightforward. A single cap up here. Only 100 volt rated. I actually managed to find a film cap in that range in my collection. Did a little bit of cleaning on the wiring, got all the gunk off of it. Still need to test the tubes. I want to verify everything works since I put it back together first, and then I'll go through and I'll start checking to see if I have any weak tubes. Don't want to change too many variables all at once. I'm already doing that as enough as it is. I went in to the wafer switches and cleaned all the contacts to the best of my ability with alcohol and Q-tips. It's slow, but sure is good reliability. Not that the set will really be used anything except on like channel 3 and 4, but I like to do the whole switch assembly either way. Now, the 3 resistors in here that I was looking at, the 1 waters, I have replaced 2 of them. And I know I'm kind of breaking my own rule. I mentioned that film capacitors are inductive. Metal film apparently worse than carbon. I've been doing a lot of reading on the subject. And I didn't want to use them in this unit, but I went through the offerings most companies have, and for 1 watt carbon comp parts, there's maybe 10 available values at best from most places that I've seen. And I looked at the schematic and I said, okay, are these in anywhere like the oscillator circuit where they could definitely have an impact? And the answer in this case is no, actually. These 3, with this one right here, I did not replace. That's the 47 kilo ohm one. These 3 resistors that are all tied to this common point, this is the B plus post, this orange wire that runs out there. These are all part of the plate supply in the deal, and then it comes back to the main chassis to the power supply. So that part of the circuit being even a little bit inductive shouldn't really affect anything. If, again, I'm not an RF engineer, but just looking at it, it'd be the equivalent of having, I guess, a choke in the plate circuit. The plate circuit is not being used to couple the signal to anything, from what I was looking at. So I should be fine using these in here. This one was way off. It was 68 registering is about 87 kilo ohms or so. The 1.8 was going high at about 2.5, which isn't too bad. But the higher they go, the lower the plate current to the front end of the set, and I just wanted to eliminate that as a possible problem. The other resistors in here, they're fine, and I can't dig them out anyway if I needed to replace them. So I'm going to button this back up, get this all reassembled and tucked back into the cabinet, and then we'll see what we get. And I'll try to dig out a better signal source. Alright, so we got all the guts back in and rigged up temporarily. VCR's output, maybe, I can't remember if it's channel 3 or channel 4. I think it's channel 3. We are getting a signal through the RF section, and we are getting audio.
Styles at the auto shows, and thus far, it's been a huge hit with crowds at the shows.
Now, the audio is pretty good. It's coming through relatively clear. However, the image has got issues. For one thing, the focus sucks. A lot of detail is lost. I'm running it at 120 volts, so that's roughly what line voltage should be right about now. Yeah, I haven't done anything. I haven't done an alignment on it. I haven't messed with it. What I am noticing is that it is shaking up here. It's wobbling at the top, bottom and top, so I need to look into that. Don't have a lot of contrast control, to be honest. It's there, and it's not much. And of course, this is, I mean, that's maximum brightness. Maybe if we lower the brightness, we get a little better contrast control. Not really. But this is not something you're really going to be able to watch. Well, with the lights on, yeah, you can still see it now that I'm running it at this voltage. However, I am also getting this obnoxious squiggly line in here. I don't know if that's visible with this overhead light off. Yeah, it's still there. So I don't know what's going on with that. But again, having not done an alignment on it, see if that makes things better. I think that has to do with the adjustment. The horizontal and the vertical are very picky. Yeah, so I need to see what frequency the horizontal oscillator is free running at and make sure everything's where it ought to be since I changed components there. The vertical, very touchy. Very, very narrow band where it's happy and locking. And I find if I change channels, it's not always guaranteed to want to lock back there nicely. Yeah, see, it was fine. And now I have to tweak that a little bit, and then we have to tweak the vertical again. So I probably need to go into the front end and check the instructions for that. And of course I want to go through and check the tubes and see if I have any that are a little on the weak side, because the CRT is kind of weak. Tubes could also be a little bit beat up after all these years. Also, it looks like my linearity is really bad. His head is crushed and his body is stretched out. In fact, actually, I don't know if I can get to the vertical linearity with the tools I have right now. Trying to find what I have here. Alright, his head looks a little better now. Oop, a little too much. So truth be told, this is my first time, or technically second time, actually aligning a television. There's a lot of different things going on. As far as the setup goes, on the bottom I've got my Heathkit IG57A marker sweep generator. This is for the later IFs in the 40 megacycle range. And all of these switches here, except for the first one, which is a 400 hertz modulation output, are crystal controlled. So they're all set frequencies, which is really nice. And most of them in here are in this Philco, except for the very last IF frequency, which is 44.4 megahertz and is not covered by this unit, which is why I've got my Precision E200C perched on top here. Once I find the cable for this, for the output, which I custom made, which is walked off for some reason, I'm going to see if I can't check this with the oscilloscope I borrowed from work, make sure the output frequency is right, because we are using the highest band, which is mostly just harmonics being generated, and see if that'll work to tweak the very last IF. I got all the ones ahead of it tweaked. I got the sound and adjacent sound carrier ones lowered. To give you an idea what the output looks like, the signal generator here is output through the marker output, and it goes directly into the mixer stage on the tuner. You can't really see it in there, but the 6x8 oscillator mixer tube has a shield around it that's built into it. What I did was I took a one of those clamp-style tube shields that just grips the outside of the tube. I grabbed one of those out of my parts bin, I rolled some tape around the outside of it to make it non-conductive, and then I pressed it down over the tube to inject a signal. That's how they specify to do it. You're supposed to put an insulated piece of metal in between the shield and the tube, and then connect the output of your generator to that, and then of course the ground side goes to chassis ground. So that's all great. That's working. And the IG57 here also has two adjustable bias voltage outputs, which is super handy because the Predicta needs a -6 volt and a -3 volt output for the AGCs, and there are two connections directly on the board for that the SAMS covers. So that's covered by this guy. And then the output that we're looking at on the oscilloscope actually comes directly off the video detector. So there's a single wire that comes out of the IF strip here and goes over to the deflection board. We're connected onto that with a probe and then grounded to chassis. And that's technically what we're looking at right now, although I only have a flat line on the scope. However, hold on one second. Okay, so if we turn on the modulation here, this is going to modulate whatever signal that we select at 400 hertz to make it easily visible on here, because what we're looking at is a detected signal, effectively, because the video carrier is all AM. The sound is FM, but all the video crap is AM. So this should be able to detect it rather easily. And if I just pick the, let's say, 42.75 frequency, there we go. We get a little trace right there. I don't know if my camera is actually picking that up or not. Looking through the viewfinder, it looks kind of staticky. But yeah, you can see we have a little sinusoidal wave on there. And all I'm doing is I'm watching this waveform, and I'm taking one of my hex adjustment tools. I have a whole bunch of these original TV adjustments tools, and going in and tweaking the appropriate core in there. There are also 4 adjustments up here. These are predominantly for suppressing the sound carrier and the adjacent sound carrier from the video output. And then I think there's a wave trap pick-off for the sound somewhere over in the deflection board. Haven't touched that yet. But I've already done the sound part, and I just got to do the very last core. But again, got to use a separate generator for that. On the whole, once I figured this out, it's been pretty easy. They do specify, and the IG57 is set up for it, that it has a horizontal scope output. So we set this up in XY mode, basically. So the output for that, the external trigger, is from the generator here, and then the output from the video detector is purely the Y input. And that works pretty well. I did try it out just using line frequency as the reference. I think that'll work. But yeah, it was giving me some fits before I set it up like this, like they recommend. But yeah, I got to get the precision hooked up, check to make sure the output's at 44.4 or as near as I can get it, and then see if I can't get this aligned all the way. Okay, so I think the alignment went more or less okay. But I did power it up and didn't see much change except for I still had jittering on the screen in the vertical section. So I'm actually in the midst of checking a few things, make sure I didn't make any screw-ups. I am going to hook up a signal source to it again, and we're going to verify that it's going through the IF stages, and then it shows up here, and I want to try and isolate the source of the jitters. But one of the things that I discovered while doing some research and probing around was in the horizontal section. The horizontal section doesn't appear to be giving me any problems, although I don't have a lot of adjustment. You go one way and it locks in pretty nicely, go the other way and it loses it pretty quickly. A decent amount of adjustment, more so than vertical. However, there are a pair of selenium diodes in this thing in a little plastic package, this little guy, that plugs into the board. This is actually for the automatic frequency control. This is the phase comparator. I forget exactly what it's called. It compares the sync pulse to a signal coming from the actual oscillator and generates a voltage based on the difference in order to set the frequency that the oscillator runs at. I think usually by adjusting the grid bias. The point is there's two diodes in this little package. Cathodes are tied to the center pin. The anodes are tied one each to the outer 2 pins. Very simple construction. I'm told these usually go bad. And I hadn't thought about it because it plugs into the board, and I thought, oh, it's an encapsulated part. Well, I checked it on my meter. Only one section on both of these, both the one from this TV and the one from my Siesta that I pulled for comparison, the exact same one is toast. No reading at all in either direction, and I tried 2 different meters. And the same section on these does read in one direction, but only half of it's working. So I checked to see what other folks did, and they recommended that a 1N4148, very common switching signal diode, is an easy replacement. So I have fabricated this little guy. Here, let me show you on the top of the VCR here. So there's our original. Here is my replacement. It is simply 2 1N4148s attached to a section of header because standard headers have a 1/10 inch spacing on them. And these guys right here are the same spacing, just with a pin missing in between. So this is a nice match and should socket right in place. So we're going to give this a go and see if that makes any difference. It's in the horizontal section, so I don't think it's going to make too much difference. Might make the horizontal a little easier to control. And I also have a breakout socket attached to the vertical output tube because I want to double check the voltages on it and make sure that it's working right. And it also means I'll be able to hook an oscilloscope up and check to see that the sync pulses going to that circuit are the right shape and that they're relatively even, because I have a suspicion they might not be. And if we see we still have the same problem going through the RF section, I'm going to connect the output of the VCR, the composite output, directly to the video detector input on the main board and see if the problem persists, just to rule out the head end. So, first thing we need to do here, plug the TV back in, get the soldering iron out of the way. And for the sake of testing, we are only going to bring it up to about 117 volts because that's what it would expect.
Hi, I'm Jack Dalby.
Oh, Jack, your head does not look good. It's a little small on you, buddy. I have the linearity control cranked to where it registers on the meter because it tends to go off scale if I go the other way. But you can see this business that it's doing here. Don't much care for that, and I don't think it's going to get much better if I adjust the fine-tuning. Okay, here's where we're at. I did a little futzing around with the horizontal section. I didn't find any instructions in the SAMs about how you're supposed to properly set the oscillator up, but there is both a tuned slug for the tank circuit for the oscillator, and then there's a horizontal frequency adjust pot on the back of the chassis, in addition to the horizontal hold control in the front. So the only thing I could think of doing was to set the horizontal frequency control and the hold control to the center position, because that would be, based on how the SAMs word some of its stuff, dead center for the potentiometer is the normal operation setting. Based on the resistance chart that they used, that's what works out for these pots. So right now I have that centered. I tuned the slug to the point where the picture locked once both of those were centered, and it was happy. I'm looking at the signal right now in the scope. Scope claims frequency is about 15.73 kilohertz, but it also shows that the frequency is holding nice and steady. It's not flipping out. When it loses signal, it goes bananas. So that seems to be working okay. If I unhook this, what happens? Because it's technically part of the circuit. Nothing. Good. Okay, the next thing I want to check then is what the sync pulses look like, because we're not losing sync, which is nice. It seems to be holding on there pretty good, and I also noticed that if I change channels, let me just quickly do that. Like that, and then come back. Look at that. Go back that way. Come back. Ta-da! So that works out pretty nicely, and eventually does click into place. Horizontal has, well, it's not a huge range, but it's better than I had before, and it stays put. So it doesn't want to freak out. Vertical, on the other hand, vertical is very touchy, way too touchy. That is obnoxious. So I still think there's something a little bit wrong with the vertical section. Again, I can shove a composite video signal out from the VCR direct to that input. The other thing is I'm using a VCR. VCRs generally have crap RF modulators in them, from everything that I've been told. And the Predicta is a cheap television. It's not the best designed thing in the world, so I might be asking a lot of it. But at least the sound sounds good.
In America and throughout the world, based on the appeal.
Yeah, sound, no issues. And of course, he's going to do a few loops around there. But all the other controls work. Horizontal hold, vertical hold, the linearity stuff. All of that's working. It does look like I'm centered pretty decently. I'd call that pretty decently centered. Contrast control does work. I thought it would have more range, but maybe not. But I'm going to pull the SAMs. I'm going to check the voltages on the vertical output tube, and then I'll get back to you if I find anything. Okay, this is where we're at the moment. I haven't done much of anything with centering the image or really messing a ton around with the height and width controls. Because the main thing I was focusing on was just getting a stable image. Now we can see that we've still got wobbling horizontally, like the image is twitching, but it's not losing horizontal lock. I think we're getting interference somewhere in there, and I'll need to probe it out on the board. The main problem I was having was the vertical. It was basically just, it just twitched right there. It was having trouble locking. If I left it for long enough, it would drift and it would fall off, and it would start flipping around. Now, it probably doesn't help that I'm using a lot of quick moving imagery on here, which the TV wasn't really intended to work with. But I do have a little more range of motion before I lose lock. Not a whole lot, but a little more. And it does grab it a little better than it did before, but I have a small amount of adjustment now. The reason for that is because I replaced the vertical linearity control. I'd heard that was a common failure point on the Predictas. Having looked at the schematic, I can see why. It's part of the cathode circuit on the vertical output tube, and the original was a wire wound rated at 1 watt. 1500 kiloohms with 1.5 kiloohms with a 180 ohm stop. So there's a minimum resistance you could get out of it. So I pulled it out of there, and I bought a replacement potentiometer off of DigiKey. I bought a 2 watt wire wound. I don't know if it's a wire wound or a carbon jack. It feels like a wire wound. Either way, it's rated at 2 watts. I added a 180 ohm resistor to the lower end of it to act as the stop. So technically it's closer to 1.68 kiloohms. Whoop-de-doo. Installed that in there. We're trying it out now, and that seems to have helped quite a bit with the stability. I also have a decent amount more control before. That's the linearity cranked all the way up. That's the linearity cranked all the way down. Curious, do I lose lock really easy if I mess with it there? It seems to snap a little better like that. Of course, the linearity looks terrible. So if we bring it back out, now if I turn it all the way up, ooh, yeah, it does not want to lock. But if I back it off a little bit, make it a little more reasonable, I had to re-watch Bob Anderson's video on how to set up Predictas for Best Picture. Yeah, he discussed the fun relationship between the horizontal, the vertical height, vertical linearity, and everything else. And you can see we're still kind of squished. So we need to stretch that out a little more. That's better. Another thing you're noticing is on the words here, there's tearing on the sides. You can see it stretches out here, which is what it makes me think there's something wrong in the horizontal circuit. Now I say that I've replaced everything with like-for-like components, but it's possible that the tubes... I did not actually test the 2 tubes that are in the output, or I should say the damper tube and the actual horizontal output, or the horizontal driver tube that drives the flyback. I didn't pull those and check them, so I was too busy checking everything else. So I think that's what I'll do next. Well, I hypothesized earlier that maybe using my VCR as the primary video source was not the brightest idea. Yeah, well, I've proven that 2 times in a row now. First with the TV37, and now with this Predicta. I don't know how obvious it is, but the video, as you can see, is very stable, as a matter of fact. And there's no frittering around, no fidgeting. Yeah.
Here we are, sir. Our finest accommodations, complete with cellmates. Gentlemen, I give you Dr. Newsom. Hi, he's BJ, I'm Hawkeye.
And once the set warmed up, and actually I was off... Here, I'll show you. I can flip this thing to channel 4 real quick. Throw it. Yep, there it goes. Throws it off. Back to channel 3. Give it a second. And there we go. Now, obviously, I still haven't done a proper setup on this to get the image squared up. It seems like I have to actually take the front of the damn thing apart to properly do that, because I can't... The shadow mask is in the way, so I can't see the edges of the screen. I mean, to me, it looks pretty good. I'm half tempted to just leave it the hell alone, because I've screwed with it enough. But yeah, it turns out the solution is just not to have a god-awful cheap video source. So I'm going to invest in a DVD player. I'm told that there's plenty of cheap DVD players that are substantially better in quality in terms of video output. And I mean, I expected the RF modulator in this VCR to be bad. It's proven that time and time again. But I did not expect the composite video signal out of this VCR to be bad as well. So this is actually really, really nice. It's also really nice I'm apparently able to pick up a TV signal in the basement. But yeah, honestly, I guess now all I have to do is shove it back in its cabinet and get the image figured out. Okay. I have repackaged the set in its cabinet, put the back on. I actually re-terminated the ends of the wire from the antenna. The twin lead was chopped off partway in. I bought a big roll of the stuff off of eBay months ago. So I cut a new piece, and I used one of the ruined 5.6 ohm thermistor fusible resistor things, and I pulled the pins off of it and attached them because the VHF terminals on these use those pins to connect the twin lead to the terminals back here, and I don't have anything close to it, so I salvaged them from something that was junk. And I'm actually injecting the signal from my pattern generator using a single alligator clip directly into the antenna, so I know it's working, which is nice. Just kind of curious how, yeah. A pretty strong RF signal on there. Either way, I'm seeing, at least to me, the linearity looks pretty good side to side. I think I might be shifted over. I'm seeing more of this bar over here than I am of that one. I don't know how well that comes over in a camera. I'm just trying to see if I really need to screw with the centering much, because it's a whole big mess back there. And when I watch it, it seems fine. Well, let me switch back to what I was watching earlier. I've got the cable box hooked up, so I should just be able to... Where is it? Don't got much on... I mean, that's max brightness, but it kind of blocks out some of the contrast there. I seem to have better contrast when I'm using the signal generator than I do when I have it set to here. But, yeah, it seems to be working out pretty decent. I don't think there's any real reason to really mess with everything. I fiddled with the height and vertical linearity quite a bit to get it to the point where it wouldn't just roll. In fact, if I tune it off channel and tune it back, it should not have any issues with locking. Give it a second. It's going to make a fool out of me, isn't it? Come on. Needs a little bit of help, but it's not the worst. I mean, this box wasn't really intended for use with a television this old, but it seems to be doing okay. Unfortunately, this is the only thing that I cannot get rid of, all this wonderful smearing here. It's less prevalent on older programs, but as soon as anything with rectangles or that sort of deal shows up, it becomes pretty noticeable. Which is kind of unfortunate. Now, I've also got the focus connection swapped from the ground pin to the, I think it's a voltage divider off the boost supply. It's maybe a little sharper? I honestly can't tell. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little, do a little bit of research on how big the picture should be for Predicta, just to make sure that I don't have it stretched out past the edges too much, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, I went back and I reviewed Bob Anderson's video on getting the best image out of a 17-inch picture tube set, and honestly, this actually seems pretty darn good. Just in general, it doesn't look like I have any real horizontal linearity problems. I think the image is really rotated or anything. It looks to be fairly even. I'm basing it on, I'm picking 4 points. I'm comparing where they're touching the shadow mask, because obviously they are extending off of here. There's a full square width on either side that we can't see. Having taken apart the front of my Holiday, this is a very nice clean set. And I had to do some not so nice things to get this apart, and I really don't want to damage the finish on this. Wow, it's warm. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave well enough alone, because the more I screw with it, the bigger the chance that I really screw something up. So let's tune back to this. Now I did touch the horizontal control just a little bit when I moved off there. And you can see twisting the horizontal also occasionally touches the vertical. But I do have a fairly wide range of horizontal lock versus the vertical. Apparently the vertical is just picky on a Predicta. But it's watchable. Although I think if this converter box had a slightly higher output, it might be better. One thing I can try, if I can figure out what I did with my equipment, is I can hook the composite output of that up to the blonder tongue, and then we'll see if the blonder tongue can output a stronger signal and give us slightly better fidelity. I don't think so, but you know, it's worth a try since I'm here, right? And here we are, RF art. Oh, no, I guess it is still on that channel. I don't know, does that look better or worse to you? I don't know, that does look like a better image to me. But I do think that looks a lot better when it's got a better modulator hooked up to it. I imagine the one that's in here is probably not quite as powerful. Modern digital television doesn't really need to have a whole lot of gain, I guess. But yeah, that does look quite a bit better. The darks, there's a lot more difference in the light levels on their clothing, for example. The blacks and the grays are much more apparent. Alright, yeah, so audio's fine. This modulator is leaps and bounds better. Yeah, that sand actually looks like sand and not a bunch of grays for the most part. So, not bad. I mean, obviously modern programming is not going to look the best, so... Future me here. So the owner of the Predicta asked me if I could have the set done by August 18th, which is the Puget Sound Antique Radio Association's annual vintage technology swap meet. It's always on a Sunday every single year in August. That was coming up rather quickly, and at the time I didn't yet have the linearity control in, and I was still dealing with the signal problems, and I told him maybe I might be able to do it. I will try to have that figured out by then. Well, after I figured out what the problem was, being that my crappy VCR wasn't providing a good signal, something I should have remembered from when I used it on the Pilot TV37, I was able to get pretty much everything dealt with. As a matter of fact, Saturday night, the day before the event, I ran the set for at least 2 hours straight, watching reruns of the Three Stooges on MeTV. Basically, MASH, anything that was on. And I watched it for stability to make sure that it didn't, roll on the vertical. The horizontal is rock solid. Yeah, you might have to adjust it if you switch to a different video source, but it stays put. You got a decent range of adjustment. The vertical, I could never really get a whole lot of range out of it. It had a very narrow spot where it was happy, and you might have to tweak it for the individual signal that you're working with. However, I told him I'll have it put together. I made a new foot for the bottom. I got the antenna hooked back up with new twin lead. I got the whole thing reassembled, and I told him I would have it set up and playing at the event, and he could look at it and see if he was happy with it. And if he was, he could take it home, and if not, I could keep trying to make it better. Here's some footage of what it looked like set up and playing. I actually got some black and white westerns and borrowed a DVD player to actually have something better to play on it, and I think it turned out pretty well, actually. I left it on for almost the entire event until he came to get it, so several hours of that TV playing.
I am the unhappy mother of triplets. Here it is.
Which brings us to now. The event is over. It was great. Weather was nice. And honestly, I'm just doing a bit of a retrospective at this point. This wound up taking way too long. I should have had the set done a little while ago. And I just wanted to just look at a few things that I thought were important. First off being having a good signal source. The VCR, not a good option. Ultimately, having the blonder tongue is just a more accurate signal source. And it has a decent amount of adjustability that nothing else that I own has. And the amount of configurations I can do with the channel system is really nice. And I can technically use it as an over-the-air broadcasting unit with a pair of rabbit ears. Not very far, but it does work. And in fact, the Predicta managed to pick this up without being connected through the shielded cable just being close enough to the back, which is kind of funny. But ultimately, I borrowed the DVD player, a better composite signal source, put it through the blonder tongue, and was able to have a stable signal. I noticed it did roll once or twice while it was warming up. Part of that was because the movie I was playing was a 1937 film reel, and I noticed that the footage from that wasn't stable. It was jumping up and down like the synchronization on whatever playback method they used. When they digitized it, wasn't perfect. So I don't know if that was throwing off the vertical lock or not, but over the long term, it wasn't having issues. And ultimately, the customer was happy. They took it home, and they're very excited to have me work on the tandem. I can't say the same, actually. It's chassis is sitting over here just off to the side, waiting for its turn. That being said, this should be a lot easier, honestly. Having already done a holiday, or 90% of my own holiday, I have an idea what to look for in this. Getting the board out, much easier. People say the 17 inches are supposed to be better sets. I think the 21 is maybe a little easier to service when it comes to taking things apart. Either way, in addition to having a good signal source, another thing I learned is the vertical linearity control pot. Those go bad. I don't know if they also have the same problem on the 21 inchers, if that pot is in the cathode circuit of the vertical output tube, and it's rated about the same range as the one in the 17 inch, I could see it failing, because it's handling all the cathode current effectively. Which is maybe not the best design. But I replaced that wire wound pot on the Princess with a brand new 2-watt wire wound off DigiKey, and all I had to do was open up the hole in the back of the chassis that holds it a little bit, and it fit right in there. Super. In fact, I actually... Oh, that's not it. This is what I ultimately wound up going with. And the best part is the hole for the vertical linearity control in the back will fit this without modification. So this is just a pretty typical panel mount. Is this wire wound or is this carbon? It feels like a carbon pot. Either way, it's rated at 2 watts. Made in Canada. It's kind of nice. If you want the part number off of DigiKey, here it is. Yeah, it's a carbon pot. Anyway, these are recommended off of the Antique Radio forum. I was able to simply open up the hole, and the little locking tab that's on these pots right here, a little guy right there, is supposed to fit into the panel hole. The original pot is attached to the chassis by means of two screws and nuts, and there are a pair of holes on either side of the center to lock it in place. The leftmost hole is actually, well, either of the holes are actually the right distance from center that this peg will just fit right in there with no modifications, which I thought was pretty cool. However, after opening up the hole for this, the bracket that holds the socket for the CRT connections will have to be altered. You'll have to grind and file away in order to match the opening size for this shaft, which is, I don't think it's quite 3/8, but it's close to that. So you do have to do a little bit of modifying to that, and additionally, the original has a 180, it's got a 180, is it 180 ohms? Yeah, it's 180 ohms. There's a stop built into the original that it hits on the way down, so the minimum that the pot can be set at is 180 ohms. I just added a 180 ohm 1 watt plus resistor to the outside of this and tied that to a convenient ground, and that seems to have worked quite nicely. Otherwise, you just get a flat line across the CRT and the vertical dies. Not good. But that's going to do it for this Predicta, and I need to get busy working on this. We need to figure out why this set has no B+. It's the first thing I want to do. But as always, thanks for watching, and thanks for sticking it out. I hope I haven't bored you to death too much.